A few videos back, I discussed something called the Devil's Mill, and how one could employ the augmented sixth chord, known as the German sixth, in its construction. I did this not just to explain the German sixth in a dry and analytical fashion as many do, but also to show how it can be used in a more musical context. And while interesting, the German sixth does have the issue of, on its own, just sounding like a dominant seventh chord, that although resolves in different ways than a dominant, is not, when isolated, that exciting of a chord, as it is more or less just a theoretical respelling of the dominant seventh chord in order to justify its non-standard resolutions. If you haven't seen my video on the Devil's Mill, I discuss all of this in more detail there. However, in this video I will endeavor to do the same thing with the French sixth, and hopefully I will help remove some of the confusion music students often have towards it. Unlike the German sixth, the French sixth has a very unique sound all on its own, and is not just a theoretical respelling of another standard chord. I will be honest in saying I don't feel the French sixth is explained very well elsewhere on YouTube. Sure, the construction of the chord and how it resolves is outlined by many on this site properly. However, the greater question of where it comes from is not, to my knowledge, often highlighted. So therefore, it would be my privilege to discuss one explanation for how the French sixth actually manifests, and how this explains the odd and fairly dissonant voicing of the chord. And furthermore, I hope that the explanation I deliver in this video will put much of the supposed mystery behind Richard Wagner's Tristan Chord or Tristan Chord to bed. For novices to the topic of augmented sixth chords, there are three: the Italian, French, and German sixth. The French sixth is almost always demonstrated in theory books in a 4/3 inversion voicing, as this clearly outlines the augmented sixth. But I would also say merely presenting the chord in this fashion deprives the student of some necessary additional info. In pure figured bass terms, this is probably the most proper way to demonstrate the chord, as in the case of this example on screen, the A flat is best understood as the stabilest bass note, or dare I say, root of this augmented sixth chord. But even the reason as to why this is the stabilest bass note is often left out of modern explanations of the French sixth. So to remove us from the restrictions of voice leading, I would like to describe a shortcut to constructing and understanding the French sixth, before we get to where it comes from. First off, let's take the standard portrayal of the French sixth as a 4/3 chord, and invert it in such a way as to create something akin to a seventh chord in root position. Once we do this, we can observe how this quasi-inversion from the standard French sixth is almost a dominant seventh chord, save the fact that its chordal fifth is flattened. Therefore, for anyone looking to construct a French sixth quickly, they might find it easiest to just play a dominant seventh and then flatten the chordal fifth. But as far as voicing this chord is concerned, it is still best to have the flattened fifth as the lowest note in the bass. So how does this particular French sixth built above A flat typically resolve? Well, most of the time it resolves to the G major triad. But the question is why? Some will propose that the French sixth exists in order to solve the issue of parallel fifths that are present if a German sixth built on an A flat were to resolve to a G major triad. But while this is an adequate reason, it is only part of the story, as the question remains as to how do we get from a chord with an A flat in it that resolves to G major, which is a key a bit far removed from any key with A flat in it on the circle of fifths. This is the very reason why I find most explanations of the French sixth inadequate, as they do not tell the music student where this chord comes from and how best to use it in a strict sense. Obviously, liberties can be taken with just about any rule in music now, but only showing how this chord resolves gives the young student of harmony perhaps a false impression that this chord is something entirely native to G major, and the French sixth a mere stand-in for the dominant of G major. And this is partly true, but there's a better explanation. The trick lies in not seeing the French sixth, in the case of this iteration of it with the A flat in the bass, as a phenomenon of G major, but rather of C minor. To explain this, we will use something called the rule of the octave, which I'm sure my subscribers who have looked a bit into Baroque partimenti are already well acquainted with. But to put it simply, the rule of the octave, which stems from at least the early 18th century, is a figured bass pattern that explains how one can smoothly apply harmonies to the ascending and descending diatonic scales of major and minor. There are several iterations of the rule of the octave, but we will focus on one type and only on the descending variant. Firstly, let's look at this descending rule of the octave in C major. Here we can see that the chord built above the 6th scale degree gives us a secondary dominant of a D dominant 7th chord, which takes us nicely to the dominant triad of G major, built on the 5th scale degree. Quickly thereafter follows the dominant 7th, and we are taken back to the tonic. Now if we apply this same pattern to the descending scale of the parallel C natural minor, and harmonize each scale degree with a chord in much the same fashion, we run into an issue on the 6th scale degree, as we now have an A flat in the bass as stipulated by the descending natural minor scale. Nonetheless, we still want to get to the dominant G major triad on the 5th degree in as smoothly a fashion as possible. So if we refer back to the major descending rule of the octave, we have the secondary D dominant 7th chord taking us to the dominant G major triad. If we use this chord in the treble, but still retain the A flat in the bass on the 6th scale degree, we then have our French 6th chord. So in essence, the French 6th is created by forcing a secondary dominant where one might think it shouldn't belong, but all the while still adhering to the natural minor scale and keeping the A flat in the bass. Therefore, a more correct interpretation of the French 6th is an altered dominant of the dominant in minor, built over the descending 6th scale degree in natural minor. As a caveat, I am of the opinion that minor is taught very poorly nowadays, with most modern students and composers having a very poor understanding of it, relying almost entirely on harmonic minor, and neglecting the harmonic potential of natural minor and what we now call melodic minor, something I will be remedying in my diatonic voice leading course that channel members can access as lessons are released every other week. But back to the topic at hand. The explanation I have given does not mean that the French 6th must always manifest in this fashion, but it does show one of the better cases for its usage, and also informs the composer of where they are borrowing the accidentals of the French 6th from. In this fashion, a student of composition can begin to see that the French 6th is not just a chord to be treated in a purely building block and vertical fashion, but a voice leading phenomenon that erupts out of the junction between two incorruptible motions at once, the descending melodic minor, and a secondary dominant preparing the dominant of the minor mode. Together they create the French 6th, which is often described as the most dissonant of the augmented 6th chords, but in context it is incredibly satisfying when used properly. And now, for those of you who've been eagerly waiting for me to discuss the Tristan chord, let's end the silly debate about this chord right here and right now. I don't want to get into how dumb I find most of the discourse surrounding this chord to be, or how absurd some of the explanations are, so I'll just keep it simple. The prelude to Wagner's opera, Tristan und Isolde, is written in A minor, so let's just transpose the descending C minor rule of the octave I showed before into A minor. Now let's take a look at what the French 6th looks like here. We have from the bottom up an F natural, B, D sharp, and A, which then moves to the dominant of A minor, E major. Now let's look at the oh so mysterious Tristan chord. Well, it's pretty much the same thing, save the G sharp in the treble. But this G sharp moves to an A natural, and is therefore just an ascending suspension or retardation. Some of my longtime subscribers will know of this type of non-chord note phenomenon from my now ancient accenti video. Furthermore, the F in the bass over which the French sixth is built descends to an E in the next chord to build the E dominant seventh chord of A minor, and a classic example of how the French sixth would behave if used in A minor, but also similar to the way it appears in the rule of the octave. There is nothing mysterious going on here. It's just a French sixth moving to the dominant as it does in the far older rule of the octave, with some clever chromaticism added in, which isn't that novel for Wagner's era either, as virtually every composer then, and decades upon decades prior, employed accenti. Here Wagner is using well-established tools to create something that has managed to confound poorly informed academics for decades. I'm not downplaying Wagner's cleverness here, but rather the so-called debate surrounding this chord. And my apologies to avant-garde musical progressivists. This isn't some smoking gun you can point to prove some directionality towards total dissonance and the democratization of all the 12 tones. It's just a composer being clever with standard tools of the era, and is no more exciting than some of the things Beethoven or Chopin would do on occasion. Furthermore, this Tristan chord, isolated without the A natural it resolves to, isn't even a chord to begin with, as the G sharp is a retardation, and the chord or implied harmony is only presented once the A natural sounds. Lots of academic stupidity follows this so-called chord around, and I think it's a good litmus test to quickly identify people in our field who like to sound clever but have very little idea what they're actually talking about. Perhaps I'd go so far as to call it one of the better manifestations of the Dunning-Kruger effect in music academia. But all that griping and vitriol aside, I hope now I've been able to do two things. First, to properly tell you where the French sixth comes from, and secondly, how that information can help you get over the mystery of the Tristan chord. And if you're interested in learning more about harmony in a ground-up fashion, consider becoming a channel member for exclusive lessons.